Hey everybody, it's Lon.TV, and a lot of you saw me post this photo the other day of me behind the controls of an airplane because I took my very first flight lesson the other day and had an absolute blast doing it. And what I thought I would do in this video is talk a little bit about my first flight and how I'll be launching a little side channel, a very tiny one, kind of covering this adventure as I continue to learn. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about how different flying is in a real plane versus using some of these plastic controls you can get for Microsoft Flight Simulator. There are some things you can really learn through a flight sim on your PC, but the real experience I found is very, very different. Let's get to it. Now, today's video is being brought to you by all of you. That includes everyone who watches this channel on a regular basis. It is greatly appreciated, especially given how hard it is to break through the algorithmic recommendations these days. And I also want to thank everyone who contributes to the channel on an ongoing basis, either through my support page at Lon.TV/support, or through Patreon, the YouTube membership program, or Floatplane. And of course, we now have merch available, including some cool shirts and mugs and everything. So if you wanted to pick up some merch, that also can help out quite a bit around here. But either way, viewership is what matters the most, and I greatly appreciate everyone's support of the channel. So now let's take a look at my first flight lesson. Now, this is the only image that I have of my first flight. I purposely did not take any video. I obviously didn't expect my instructor to be doing that. And rolling forward, I'm not going to be doing too much in the way of trying to make content around what I'm doing. What I will probably do, though, is just strap a GoPro on my chest or something so that I can see what my hands are doing while I'm flying. And I might take that footage and do a little diary on a secondary YouTube channel rolling forward to discuss this adventure as we're moving along, because I know a lot of you are interested in potentially going into doing some flight training yourself, and that might be useful for all of us. And for me, primarily because things happen sometimes very quickly, and I would love to be able to replay those events, see what my hands were doing, and try to take in that replay to improve my overall skill set moving forward. So that'll probably be how we get the footage for whatever I'm going to do with this next. But again, this is really about learning how to fly properly and content kind of a secondary thing, because I don't want to be distracted by anything other than what I need to learn to fly the plane. Now, I have been fascinated with aviation since I was a little kid. I used to play these awesome flight simulators on my DOS PC when I was in high school, like Secret Weapons of the Luftwaffe and some of the other Lucasfilm flight sims. Another one I was very much involved with was Falcon 3.0, which I recently re-downloaded in DOSBox on my Mac here. It's a lot of fun to revisit that flight simulator. And these were really fun because they were engaging flight sims. They were somewhat realistic, and it did give you a good sense of the fundamentals of flight while also having some fun along the way. And my grandfather actually flew planes in World War II, and I remember him watching me fly one of these flight simulators, and he said, you know, these are really good to maybe get some fundamentals, but you really have to fly by feeling it. You got to feel it in your butt, he told me. And he goes, you can't get that on a computer. And I really could put that statement from my grandfather in the back of my mind ever since then, because it turned out to be very true when I got into the plane for the first time. So this is the plane that I am training in. It is a Piper Cherokee 140, a very good plane to learn in, I have learned. It felt very stable in flight, even for an amateur like me. It was very forgiving, I think, as I was playing around with the controls and getting a feel for things. It has a relatively new engine. The plane is actually in really good shape. It has all of your standard avionics on board, but it does have a newer GPS unit as well. So you've got some modern stuff along with your traditional gauges. My first flight was about an hour. We did about an hour and a half or so of pre-flight checklists and stuff to learn what you have to do on the ground first. And then we got up in the air. So my instructor did take it up initially and got us out of the airspace of the airport, and then I took over from there. And what she was looking for initially was whether or not I could keep it flying stable and at a constant altitude, which I was able to accomplish after a little bit of getting used to things. And then from there, we tried some turns and then turned around and came back to the airport, where she actually let me land the plane. I'll talk more about that in a minute. I was pretty proud of myself there. Here is my profile from FlightAware, and this really kind of paints the picture of what I experienced and how different flight sims are from the real thing. So here is her climb out, and then she turned the controls over to me around here, and you can see that I was struggling quite a bit to maintain altitude. Now granted, I was just trying to get a feel for the controls, and what we wanted to do was stay at around 3,000 feet or so. It was a very, very bumpy morning, or afternoon I should say, because it was in the 90s here in Connecticut. We had a lot of thermals coming up from the ground, so you could feel the air was very unsettled, which actually was great for a first flight because I really had to learn how to keep the plane stable when the wind is knocking it around. And that was what I think really threw me off initially here. It felt very overwhelming up until I got to about here, as you can see, because all of those forces working against the plane are something you can feel. And my entire 30 years of flight simulators has been almost entirely visual. I never had any kind of physical input to what I was experiencing. And that was one of the biggest things that I had to get used to. But once you started getting a feel for it, especially as I turned out of the wind and into the wind, you could feel how the air interacts with the flight surfaces, how it impacts your sense of balance. And after a few minutes, it was feeling not natural necessarily, but a lot better, to the point where I felt like I could get control of this airplane and do some things with it. So that's when things started getting a little better here. We then took it up to 3,500 feet, and I was able to mostly maintain that altitude. I'd love to hear from anyone watching about how this looks for a first flight insofar as what the data you're seeing here is looking like. But you can see the second half of the flight was a lot better than the first half after I got used to it. Now, as different as this new experience was, a lot of it felt familiar, again, visually, because I had spent so much time in these flight simulators. And lately, of course, I've been playing with Microsoft Flight Simulator because I've got it as part of my Game Pass subscription. And what's amazing is how close this looks to real life as I was flying around in the plane. Now, this is a Cessna 172 that it's modeling here. I don't have the Piper plane downloaded for it yet, but it looked like this as I was flying. It was a little hazier the day that I flew, but you can even set the weather patterns to be more realistic. And the water looks the same. The city of Hartford looked the same out the left side of the window. So this is going to be a very helpful tool, I think, especially as I'm learning and practicing touch and goes and going into different airports. I think it can set you up visually for how things should be, but there's nothing that can really replace the experience of actually flying a plane. But I have bought some stuff over the years that I've been playing with, and I wanted to get some feedback on it, because one of the things that I also felt when I got in the plane was that the controls just were so much more responsive than this stuff I've been playing with. So for example, I bought these rudder pedals off of eBay way back in 2020 when you couldn't get any of this stuff, right when Microsoft Flight Sim first came out. And the rudder pedals work, and they have even like toe brakes on the top of them too that have a separate thing that registers with the game. But they're very loose, and I can never get them as tight as the real rudder pedals felt in the plane, partly because sometimes the aerodynamics are working against the flight surfaces, and you have that going on. And when I landed the plane for the first time, it was so much easier to control the plane on the runway as we came back down, even trying to keep it on center line. I was surprised because in Microsoft Flight Simulator, I always run off the runway on the way down, and I was kind of fearful of that when my instructor turned to me and she goes, "You're going to land this plane." And sure enough, I was able to, and was able to keep it on center, and it all just felt different. And I think that was something that these rudder pedals did not get me on the flight sim side. Now, as far as my yoke is concerned, I've been using this CH Products yoke that I bought, again, back in 2020 or so when the current version of Flight Sim came out. It's not bad, but again, feels nothing like the real plane does. So I need to find something that I think gives me a little bit more of a realistic experience. So all in, it's really hard to do some of the more detailed maneuvers like landing the plane on Microsoft Flight Sim with these controls, given what I've now experienced inside of a real plane. And I found that the real plane was easier to control than the sim plane has been. So clearly I've got to upgrade my controls here to get something a little better. And I would love to hear from all of you as to what you're using, especially things that feel a little bit closer to what an actual plane might feel like. Now, one thing about Microsoft Flight Simulator that I found to be incredibly realistic is when you use its virtual reality mode. Because one of the things that I found when I was flying the real plane is that it's a lot easier when you can turn your head around and look at things versus having to use the keyboard or the mouse to do it. So right now I've got it in its regular 2D mode here, and I have to use the keyboard to look to my left or to my right, or use the mouse to do it. And that, of course, is very unnatural, especially if you're trying to learn how to fly the pattern around an airport where you need to keep the runway in sight or look around for traffic. So again, I found having the VR headset on to be much more realistic because I could look in the direction that I want to look in. So all good stuff here. I got to find some better controls, I think, but beyond that, it did set me up for at least understanding the fundamentals. But again, you got to feel it to really get good aptitude as a pilot, and that's why you train in a real airplane. So more to come on this topic. I hope to have some real imagery here soon versus what you're seeing here in Microsoft Flight Simulator, but it's amazing how close to real Flight Sim actually looks. This is running real time on a laptop right now, which is crazy, and I just have to figure out how to get the controls to feel a little closer to what they really feel like, because again, it's crazy that I was flying a real plane better than when I was flying in Microsoft Flight Simulator. So clearly I've got some problems with my controls here, but again, feeling everything makes all the difference. So more to come. I will put a link to the new channel that I'll be starting up in the video description. It'll likely just have this video to start, but we'll have more as time goes on. But again, I'm going to be focused on my training, not on the content. So a lot of it will be voiceovers of whatever GoPro footage I capture as I am going on this very exciting journey. More to come. Stay tuned. And until next time, this is Lon.TV. Thanks for watching.